Max comes to us from Northern Michigan University. He is a first semester doctoral student in the exercise science program, specifically exercise physiology. And I believe what he's going to be presenting to us today is at least a portion of his master's thesis project. So, Max, take it away.
Okay. So, anyways, what I actually am going to present to you today is basically my whole master's thesis project. But I'm going to try and get through it as fast as I can. Since it's kind of a long study, so I might go through some of the things a little bit quickly. If you do have some questions, feel free to stop me and ask. We can go over it afterwards as well. So the title of my study was the effects of high-intensity intermittent exercise and normobaric hypoxia on aerobic capacity and body composition in overweight and obese sedentary adults. I know it's a mouthful, it's quite a long name, but we couldn't really figure out a good way to kind of bring it down a little bit. So hopefully after this is over, it might make a little bit more sense to you. You might also realize that, or thought in your head perhaps, that people doing sprints in hypoxia who are overweight might seem a little impractical, which is probably true, but nonetheless I had quite a bit of fun. So just to start off, we all know that there's a significant problem with obesity, but just to highlight some statistics, and I mean, depending upon which sources you look at, statistics are of course going to vary. These numbers are actually pretty conservative, but nonetheless, roughly, this was from 2012, 69% of adults age 20 and older are obese, and I know that number has gotten a little higher since. Approximately 300,000 deaths a year are obesity related. Again, that's a pretty conservative number as well. Depending upon what you look at, you can see that quite a bit higher. Aside from the fact that lots of people are overweight and obese, and there are lots of death, with that comes a pretty significant economic burden, and again, from this same study, it suggests that there might be over $100 billion a year that are spent on obesity, with the average obese person in comparison to a regular weight person costing an extra $1,429. And if you factor in all of the obese people, that comes out to a pretty astronomical number. So, long-term solutions, as we've seen, seem to remain elusive, as I put there, and I think it's legitimate to ask or try and think outside of the box with ways to try and bring that number down, even though I might have thought too far outside of the box with this study, but so the first topic that I'm going to talk about is high-intensity intermittent exercise, commonly called high-intensity interval training or HIIT training. It's gained some popularity over the course of the past couple of years. By definition, HIIT training is brief, intermittent bursts of vigorous activity followed by periods of rest or low-intensity exercise. Typically, we're talking about 30 seconds to 2 minutes of an all-out sprint followed by some active recovery or rest. Most of the studies in the past were done looking at performance variables, but more recently they've looked at HIIT training and its effects on more clinical obese populations, which kind of sparked my interest. Some of the studies that you can look at, you'll see showing greater increases in things like VO2 max, body composition, we're talking about fat loss here, and resting energy expenditure, at least acutely. And I know there are many more variables to look at. For my study, I kind of narrowed it down to those three, and you're going to see running theme as we get through it. I guess the main thing to note again with HIIT training, you see some of these favorable adaptations that happen with people, and it's a more time-efficient form of exercise when you compare it to something like steady-state, long-duration exercise. So when we talk about, again, like clinical population, it might be a good idea to investigate it a little bit more simply based on the fact that it might be effective and it doesn't take a tremendous amount of time, and at the same time it's perhaps effective as well. And some of the studies, I'm not going to go through all of these for the sake of time, but I just listed 3 studies here that are kind of integral to my own research. This first study just kind of looked at a group who was doing steady-state long duration exercise for quite a long time, I believe it's 60 minutes, 65% VO2 max, versus another group who was doing this type of HIIT training, 30-second sprints followed by 4.5 minutes of recovery. They did that over the course of 6 weeks, and despite the fact that the HIIT group was doing significantly less work as well as going for shorter amounts of time, they saw similar adaptations in aerobic capacity. The second one, the effects of high intensity intermittent exercise and body composition. This was a study that did something very similar, and they took a group of people, again, who was doing this type of HIIT training over the course of 6 weeks, and they saw significant fat loss, which is not, there's been a couple studies to this day, and my study would kind of follow suit with this, that have shown, again, a really low time commitment. Again, you don't know how well people would adhere to this in the long run, but nonetheless, it could be beneficial because typically, again, with stuff like steady state, long duration exercise, especially when there's no diet manipulation, you don't typically see fat loss. And then the last one, which is a little bit more intuitive, it just compared the same total work of high intensity exercise versus steady state exercise, and at least acutely, there was a greater increase in resting energy expenditure, which again is probably a little bit more intuitive than the other ones. So now, this was a picture that was in my local newspaper. They were nice enough to come and interview me and help me recruit subjects. What happened my first semester at Northern Michigan University is they plopped this hypoxic chamber in our lab. So this is a picture of me on a bike in the lab. And I've always been interested in an obese population, and at the same time I've always been kind of fascinated with HIIT training. And then we got this hypoxic chamber in the lab, and I was really enamored by it, and I wanted to try and find a way to tie it in to my thesis. So, typically hypoxia, it's studied in the past for training purposes. So, physiological adaptations, namely increases in red blood cell production. So you sleep at hypoxia, you're going to sleep at high altitudes, you're going to get these physiological adaptations. It's going to cause the kidneys to produce erythropoietin, which is going to cause hematopoiesis of the red blood, of the bone marrow, which is going to increase red blood cells, and then you can go out into sea level, and you can exercise, create greater red blood cell mass, and consequently, you have improved exercise. Probably some of you have seen, like Michael Phelps and these people who sleep in hypobaric chambers, same concept. But that's not something that I was necessarily interested in. I just know that's something maybe some of you have read in the past. What I was interested in was seeing, was there anything that had studied hypoxia in relationship to an obese population? And sure enough, I found a couple studies, well, more than a couple, but not a lot of studies that have looked at hypoxia and its effects on things like weight loss, and acutely at least VO2 max. So again, just going to briefly go over some of these studies that I found. Again, they were kind of integral to my literature review. Influences of normobaric hypoxic training on physical fitness and metabolic risk factors in overweight to obese adults. What they found in this study was two groups did the same amount of exercise, and this kind of modeled my study just a little bit differently off of this one, as well as that first HIIT training study. They were doing 65% VO2 max in both groups. One was in hypoxia, the other one was in a sham group. So they believed they were in hypoxia, but they weren't, and over the course of 6 weeks, they saw significantly greater weight loss in the hypoxic group. This next study here was a group who they simply took of overweight adults, put them into a hypoxic chamber. They sat there for 2 weeks. They sat there for 2 weeks. They sat there for 2 hours, and what they saw was a significant acute rise in resting energy expenditure, which isn't surprising. When you go to altitude, there's less pressure. Consequently, you have to pump more blood around the body to deliver oxygen, which would increase your resting energy expenditure. But nonetheless, there's a study there. And then this last one, which was pretty significant, which was the one where I really helped me form my own study. This study looked at people who were doing high intensity exercise in hypoxia acutely. And these people who were doing this type of exercise, they took two groups of endurance runners who were already trained, and they both did a type of HIIT training inside a hypoxic chamber. And again, one of them was actually in hypoxia, the other one was a placebo group, and just over the course of 6 weeks, doing two sets of HIIT training in hypoxia, the hypoxic group then saw a significant increase in aerobic capacity, and the other group, which was in the sham hypoxia, did not. And there's a lot of, again, molecular discussions to get into with that, but of course, my study didn't look into that, and also we've done it. So ultimately what happened with, this is how I kind of formulated my study. I was interested in obesity, I was interested in HIIT training, and then this hypoxic chamber came along, and I found all these different studies, and I kind of formulated my thesis based off of that. So my question was, what would happen if I took an obese population, we did HIIT training with everybody, and one group was in hypoxia, and one group was in a sham or placebo group, or believed that they were in hypoxia. Would hypoxia multiply the effects of HIIT training on the variables of fat loss, resting energy expenditure, and maximal oxygen consumption, or VO2 max? And again, the first thing that I did was go out and recruit some of my participants. What this was actually some of those pictures I was showing you. This is the article in the newspaper for my study. Somebody from the local mining journal, is what it's called up there, is a big mining town, came and they interviewed me about the study, and this is where I got the very, very large majority of my participants from, was actually from the newspaper. It just kind of was out there and said, you know, of course, contact this individual if you might be interested in participating in this study. So what did I end up with? Ultimately, I ended up with 12 overweight or obese sedentary adults, which is not a very high number, especially when you consider that I had to make two groups out of it, so I ended up with 6 in each group. The major problem here was doing HIIT training with an obese population in hypoxia. Obviously, there's a lot of risk involved. So in terms of going through the IRB, these people could not have any other risk factors associated with them other than being sedentary and other than being overweight and obese. And with an adult population, most people who are sedentary as well as overweight or obese have quite a few other problems that come along with it. So I'd probably say I had like 35 people that contacted me and were interested, and I ended up with, again, about 12. And again, you can see the exclusion criteria or inclusion criteria. They had to be free of any other risk factors, and most people had those. And they also had to sign informed consent, as well as So here are the statistics from the hypoxic group versus the normoxic group, and I'm going to get into that in a second. But there was no significant difference between the two groups. Again, there was 6 in each group, and I'm going to talk about that in just one second. So what did we have? We had this hypoxic group, and then we had this group who believed they were going to be exercising in hypoxia. And what altitude did we set the chamber at? We set the chamber at, which is 14.5% FiO2, or roughly 3,000 meters, or about 10,000 feet. Again, this would be probably about 3,000 feet above Denver, if any of you are familiar with that. So a decent hypoxic stimulus. And then, of course, the other group, unknowingly, was at sea level. And they did this exercise 3 days per week, with 1 day in between. So now, here is this chamber. These are some more pictures. So this is what the inside of the chamber looked like. And what you did with this normal baric hypoxic chamber is it simulated altitude by changing the concentrations of oxygen and nitrogen. It would pump nitrogen into the chamber, which would bring down, obviously, the concentration of oxygen, which would simulate altitude. Because, of course, when you actually go to altitude, the pressure changes, particles disperse, and consequently you breathe in less oxygen. So this was not hypobaric, low pressure. This was normal baric hypoxia, if that makes sense. Okay. So again, what these people did in terms, I kind of modeled this after a previous study. They were doing 30 seconds of all-out sprints against 0.05 kilopounds or kilograms per kilogram weight. I took this down from the traditional Wingate because these people in the study wouldn't have been able to do that. And they had 4.5 minutes of recovery at a power requirement of approximately 30 watts. And what I did is it kind of increased throughout the study. The first 2 weeks, they did 4 sprints, so we're talking about 2 total minutes of exercise. The third and the fourth week, they got an extra one, so at that point they were doing 5, 2.5 minutes, and week 5 and 6, we increased it one more time, so they were doing a total of 3 minutes of all-out exercise 3 times a week. So it, again, ended up being 6 weeks, 18 total sessions. And the things that we looked at, again, were resting energy expenditure. All subjects went through pre and post testing. We went through all of the traditional methods for collecting energy expenditure. They were engaging in exercise for 36 hours, no caffeine 24 hours before. Their last meal was at 2000 hours the previous night before. And when they got to the actual, to the lab, we had them rest for 10 minutes in a position before we actually started collecting. And then once we did start collecting, we collected for 30 minutes. And what we did is we chopped off the first 10 minutes and the last 10 minutes and looked at the 10 minutes in between using the modified Weir equation, because obviously we weren't doing urine analysis to look at protein output. So we used, again, the modified equation in order to try and get protein factored in there as well. Okay. Next thing we did was looked at body composition. Remember I said if my study looked at resting energy expenditure, body composition, and VO2 max. For body composition, we used a DEXA scan. I got one of the local orthopedic surgeons to let me use his DEXA scan for the study, which was very helpful. The DEXA scan that we used, which was called the Lunar Prodigy, it wasn't the iDEXA, which is the more research grade DEXA scan, but according to studies, these ones are quite accurate as well. When subjects came to the lab, again, we were doing this after the resting energy expenditure. We just asked them to use loose-fitting clothing. There's really not much more that's necessary after that. Of course, we asked them to remove metal objects because this is using X-rays in order to do this. And then we measured, again, the DEXA scan. I'm going to show you a picture of it in a second. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, it measures total body fat as well as lean muscle mass or fat-free mass by using this Encore software that was purchased through another grant at our school. And of course, the DEXA was calibrated correctly before each day of testing. So here's this Lunar Prodigy DEXA. This is what it looked like. These are what the subjects were coming to, again, to that particular doctor's office in order to look at body composition. So I did this again with each subject, pre and post, to determine if this had any effect on body composition. And then the last thing, VO2 max. What we did is we just traditional VO2 max. We had people performing an exercise test to exhaustion. I used a Lodi for this, which was quite nice. We also used a Lodi throughout the study for the actual sprints in the hypoxic chamber. What we did is we increased by 1 watt every 2 seconds on the electronically baked ergometer or the Lodi. And then, of course, they had to meet the VO2 max criteria for the plateau at the end in order to be considered their VO2 max. Okay. And then for the statistics with the study, what we did is I used independent t-tests to make sure that there was no significant difference between the 2 groups, variables in height and weight and body composition, which I showed you previously. And we also ran a repeated measures mixed ANOVA to look across as well as in between groups, to see if there was any significant differences pre to post study in both groups as well as in between groups. And of course, statistical significance was set at a p-value of less than 0.0. So what did we find? This is where the story kind of gets a little bit more boring, as you might expect. Resting energy expenditure did significantly increase in both groups, but we saw no significant increase in the hypoxic group versus the normoxic group. Okay, and those are those increases that we saw, 13.4 and 11.76%, which is pretty large increases in resting energy expenditure, but thinking of how horrendously low these people's resting energy expenditure was previously before this study started, it's not incredibly surprising after doing 6 weeks of exercise. Next thing with body composition, very similar here. Interesting note though, both groups did see a significant increase or a significant loss in body fat pre to post training. But again, there was no significant difference between the hypoxic group and between the normoxic group. So what the kind of fat loss we're talking about here, the hypoxic group decreased body fat. Both groups lost about 2 pounds of body fat, which is pretty impressive for, again, 6 weeks of exercise, no diet manipulation, and at the same time, these people, again, you have to think, are doing between 2 and 3 minutes of exercise 3 times a week. Again, all-out exercise, of course, but nonetheless, it's not a significant amount in terms of how much the time per minute is. And then, I mean, in terms of regional measures, especially with the Prodigy DICSA, these aren't particularly great, but nonetheless, I thought I'd list them up here. There's a pretty big standard deviation with these. But what we saw with abdominal fat, the hypoxic group lost 0.6 kilograms, the normoxic group lost 0.5 kilograms. Again, we're talking about regional body or abdominal fat. And then most of it came from trunk fat, which is 0.52 kilograms, and 0.46 kilograms again, respectively. And then the rest came from minute fat loss, came from different regions of the body, and I didn't go through the list of all one of those. And now, the one pretty interesting thing about my study, and this study, and this result does follow suit with some of the previous studies that have examined higher intensity acute exercise in hypoxia. Both groups significantly increased VO2 max after this type of HIIT training, again, which is what you would expect based on the previous studies that have examined it. And then we did see a significant difference between groups. So the hypoxic group, after 6 weeks, significantly increased VO2 max to a greater degree than the normoxic group did. And I have, again, we're going from, 22.8% increase and 10.9% increase. And again, we started off very low in each one of these groups, so I'm going to show you the variables in 1 second. And this slide is a little bit confusing, but here we see pre to post. This is the hypoxic training group, pre to post. We're talking about VO2 max here. We saw a significant increase in VO2 max pre to post. Normoxic training group, same thing, significant increase pre to post. But there was also a significant increase or a significant difference between groups in terms of the hypoxic training group increasing VO2 max to a greater degree than the normoxic group did. Okay? And here are all the different variables, including standard deviations for resting energy expenditure, for fat, as well as for relative VO2 max as well. Interesting. So again, we're talking about. So moving on into a bit of a discussion of these 3 different variables. Resting energy expenditure, again, we saw a significant increase pre to post study. We did not, in terms of both groups, but we did not see a significant difference between the groups. Why you didn't see a significant increase from the hypoxic group versus the normoxic training group. I think, again, if you compare this study to the other studies that had been done, this group of individuals had a significantly less exposure to hypoxia, and at the same time, since both groups increased resting energy expenditure so significantly pre to post study, even if there had been some difference between the two, it would have been hard to kind of weigh that out between the hypoxic group and the normoxic group anyways. But again, in the end, I really don't think there was a difference, mostly based on the fact that the exposure just simply was not long enough. Now in terms of body composition, again, what we saw, both groups lost body fat significantly, pre to post study. If you remember, we're talking about 2 pounds of body fat was lost in both groups pre to post training. And why this might be, especially with this HIIT training, at least the hypothesis is that at least acutely, since there's such a significantly greater increase in things like EPOC or excess post-oxygen consumption and consequently the resting energy expenditure, there's also been some suggestions that really high intensity exercise also suppresses appetite, and that's been examined by looking at different neuropeptides. But again, my study didn't get into that discussion, so I'm not going to hammer on it a whole lot. But nonetheless, this does follow suit with those previous studies that I showed you that showed high intensity intermittent exercise to significantly decrease body fat pre to post. And again, why do I think this didn't happen between the hypoxic group versus the normoxic group? And follow suit with those other studies. I think, again, the exposure just was simply not long enough. We're only talking about between 20 and 30 minutes, 3 times a week. And again, if you compare it to those other studies, they were significantly longer. Lastly, the one interesting variable, which was the VO2 max, significantly increasing, not only in both groups pre to post training, but also between groups, in the hypoxic group increasing VO2 max to a greater degree than the normoxic group. This particular find did follow suit, again, with the previous study that had examined high intensity exercise in hypoxia versus non-hypoxia and found hypoxia to have an effect. The reasons behind that, at least their suggestions, the study that had done this previously with the endurance trainers had looked at a lot of molecular physiological markers, namely some of these, mitochondrial transcription factors. Again, this peroxisome proliferator activator receptor Y coactivator is kind of regarded as one of the masters of mitochondrial biogenesis. And in that previous study, they had found a significantly greater increase in the hypoxia group in that particular transcription factor, which would suggest that a very anaerobic hypoxic environment perhaps drives physiological adaptations to aerobic capacity, which does intuitively make sense. And then when it's coupled, again, you can get into a greater discussion of this if you'd like to in a minute. When it's coupled with high intensity exercise, the adaptations that it causes in aerobic capacity are greater if you put the person in hypoxia versus if you just simply put the person at sea level. Okay? Again, I just kind of have the same slide here. This is actually just what I talked about. And future studies that they're doing actually with this hypoxic chamber up at Northern are going to be similar in fashion, looking at high intensity exercise in hypoxia. But what they're actually going to do this time is they're going to take some muscle biopsies of the quadricep, and they're going to look not only at some of these transcription factors for, again, mitochondrial biogenesis, but they're also, in conjunction with one of the neuroscience professors, they're going to put the actual slides underneath the microscope, and they're actually going to look at mitochondrial density as well. So that study will most likely be able to answer some questions in reference to this VO2 max aerobic capacity increase that I really can't. So what are my ultimate conclusions here? This type of HIIT training in hypoxia, it was not a long enough exposure to really see a significant, if there was going to be any difference, I should say that of course from the beginning. If there was going to be any difference between the two, I don't think that the exposure was long enough to really elicit a response where you'd see a decrease or a significantly greater increase from the hypoxic group and the normoxic group. And I said here, it does appear to have an influence on aerobic capacity. Again, the reasoning behind that, of course,